stated clerk for ministry preparation and support in the Mid-Council Ministries area of the Office of the General Assembly. Before joining the OGA staff in 2009, he served concurrently for some 20 years as a pastor and professor of biblical studies and languages. He and his wife, Sherry, have 2 children, Eric, who is a doctor of pharmacology student at Duquesne University, and Larissa, who will begin in the fall of 2021 as a teaching fellow in English as a second language while pursuing her master's degree at Marian University in Indianapolis. I'll also add that Tim has taken up long distance running as a hobby and will be happy to share some of his impressive accomplishments of endurance as well. So Tim, we welcome you to the Synod of the Trinity. Thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. It is a delight to be with you all this morning and to have a chance to talk with you about some of the things that we are seeing in our society and within the Presbyterian Church and the church more widespread here in American culture. I'm going to begin, go ahead and start sharing a screen with you so that we can talk about some of these trends that we are seeing. One of the things that as we get into all of these aspects of life before us, we know that COVID has had a tremendous impact on our lives together and our lives in community. And we know that it's going to be with us well after all of the pandemic situations have kind of played themselves out. But there are some things that were already happening that may have been shaped or impacted in certain ways by the pandemic, and that may or may not be shaped in some ways going forward, but were such major movements that were already happening that we know that they are going to survive the pandemic. And so what we want to look at in this kind of time together in this first hour this morning is some of the demographic and other changes that were already happening before the pandemic and are of such importance and scale that the pandemic is not going to change them. We are still going to be dealing with these realities once we have come back to whatever normal looks like once the pandemic is behind us. And so that's going to be our focus this morning. We will certainly be glad to kind of take some questions and things and provide some time for discussion. I'll be kind of watching for some of that. I've got some colleagues here from the Synod that will help me be watching for those as well. We'll try to kind of move through things and provide some time for some discussion at the end. But again, if something comes up, be sure to go ahead and just drop it right there in the chat as a question or observation or something, and we will deal with them as we are able. It was a couple of years ago that I first really started giving attention to some of the things that were happening in terms of the demographic shifts in the United States, and was prompted by that by some stories that I was seeing in the media that were talking about how we were in a period in American cultural life where we are once again moving our population back into urban centers. If you know American history, you know that there have been these kind of periods of expansion and contraction, expansion and contraction. And we are very much now in a period of contraction back into urban centers. And this is creating some real challenges broadly across society and the economy. The couple of headlines that I've got here on this slide relate to the issue of providing medical care. In one case, dentistry, in the other case, more broad general medical care. When there is this outflow of the population back into the urban centers, and so the population densities in some of our rural areas become such that there's just simply not the population to support a dental practice or support a medical practice. there just aren't enough people there who need the service that can make it a viable economic concern. And so our country is dealing with this question in a variety of ways of trying to incentivize medical professionals and to go into these areas, perhaps to do practices over larger geographical regions and so forth. And it struck me as I was reading these stories about the things in the general economy that these are the same kinds of issues that we are seeing with some of our congregations. That it really doesn't matter, that there are a lot of reasons why the membership may be declining, but that one of the reasons that the membership is declining is simply because the population itself is declining. There aren't as many people in the communities. And so this is affecting various types of professional practice. It's affecting economic growth and the ability to run stores and all kinds of things. And it is a real factor of life in society that we cannot escape in the church because of this broader impact that it's having in just the way that we gather ourselves as Americans into communities. So that it won't matter how much more effective we are at doing something if there are simply fewer people to be reached. Now, there are other things, of course, that are happening that are affecting congregational attendance. Some of you will have seen the reports that were in the headlines and even in the secular media in the last couple of weeks about a new report that was just released by Gallup that reported it for the first time in the over 80 years that Gallup has been tracking this, that religious membership in religious communities, so whether that's churches, synagogues, or mosques, ashrams, whatever it is, but membership in religious communities in the United States had dropped below 50% for the first time in over 80 years. Now, the chart that you're seeing there on the screen tracks this out. You'll see that though there had been some kind of gradual decline over the years, going back to the 1940s when they started measuring and asking this question, it has really shifted and become much more rapid in the last 10 years, so that there's been more decrease in religious community membership in the last 10 years as a proportion of the population than there had been in the previous 70 years combined. This decline in church membership, Gallup is saying, is primarily a function of the increasing number of Americans who express no religious preference at all. They get these figures by kind of averaging responses over 3-year periods. And so during the period from 1998 to 2000, there were 8% of Americans who did not identify with any religion. But in the 10 years from that period to 2018 and 2020, that went from 8% of Americans to 21% of Americans. That 13% increase in just 10 years in no religious preference appears to account for more than half of that 20% decline that we have seen in the formal membership among Americans in religious communities. But notice that if that's 13%, that still accounts for 7% of decline that's not simply because people are not affiliating themselves with any religion in any way, and so are not choosing to join religious communities. In fact, it was interesting, if you dig deeper into this Gallup report a little beyond what's in some of the headlines, you'll see that nevertheless, there are 4% of Americans who do have membership in religious communities, but who will tell you that they have no religious preference. So there are some people who are still holding on to these traditions of its importance of membership. But that 7% gap between the 13% increase in people who say they have no religious preference and the 20% drop in religious community membership shows that there are a number of people who, and a growing number of people who will profess religious faith, but don't find any need to actually join a religious community. And so this whole issue of joining and being part of a community is something that is shifting and changing. And again, this is impacting not just religious communities, but it's impacting all kinds of social organizations and social gatherings that are seeing this idea of finding formal membership to be something that is not as important as it was in the past. This is not, however, something that is simply a pattern in younger generations. It shows up in more pronounced ways in younger generations, but it shows up at a rate that is fairly consistent across all age groups. So although the baseline percentage is different by generational cohort, in this century, so since the year 2000, there's been a near doubling in the percentage of people with no religious preference in each generational cohort. So if you're looking at, again, at the chart that I put on the screen at the moment, it shows that among the traditionalists, this is the group that we sometimes used to refer to in generational theory as the builders, the people that were born prior to the end of World War II, prior to 1946. They also have seen a doubling from 4% of the of that group to 7% who now no longer express a religious preference. Among baby boomers, it's gone in the last 20 years from 7% to 13%. Among the Gen X, so the people from the mid 60s to the mid 80s, they show that they've gone from 11% to 20%. The one group that hasn't quite doubled yet is the Millennials, and that's simply because they've not been adults long enough to be captured within the Gallup surveying of adults. But even among the Millennials, they have seen this same rate in that they have had a 50% increase in the last 10 years. So in 2010, about 22% of millennials expressed no religious preference. That's grown to 31%, so a 50% increase in 10 years, which puts them on exactly the same trajectory of doubling every 20 years that we're seeing in all of these different age groups. That, of course, is going to impact church membership. And so what we're seeing is, again, that even among the traditionalists, and these are, the proportion of them. So again, among those that are born since 1946, that group is obviously, just as a matter of span of life, they are becoming a smaller proportion of the population. But among those who are still with us, the traditionalists, 77% of them in 2000 belong to religious communities, but that has decreased by 11% in the last 20 years. Among the baby boomers, their participation as members has decreased by 9%. Gen X as well. So again, it's too early to tell about the millennials. They simply haven't been adults long enough to show up in these tracks. Now, again, so I see in the chat, Nick's asking, so how much of this is due to death? Again, this is not due to death. This is among those that are surviving. What proportion of them that are alive? What was the proportion of individuals? So these decreases are not being caused by deaths. This is among the traditionalists and the boomers and so forth. What proportion of them at those times, at these dates, were members of religious communities? And the proportions of those that are alive are dropping. So when we say that there are 58% of baby boomers who are members in 2000, that's of all the living baby boomers, of all the living traditionalists and so forth. So this is, again, this is not simply mortality that's catching up to us. In terms of cleansing membership rolls in congregations, I see that question in the chat. It's not really that either, because remember, Gallup here is asking people about what their membership is. Are they members? And so if your experience with church rolls is like mine, there are a lot of people who are still officially on church membership rolls who have long since said they're not. If you ask them, are you a member of First Church? They would say no, they haven't been there in a long time. And the church may not have taken them off the roll yet. So again, this is not just ecclesiastical bookkeeping. These are the statements that are being offered by the folks about their own affiliations and associations. So one of the things that is happening then that kind of combines these two things is we're seeing population migration and shift. And as we're seeing this declining association and joining in membership, is that across the board, congregations are getting smaller. I'm going to show you some numbers specific to the PCUSA. But I was in a meeting about probably 6 weeks ago now with Mark Chavis, who is a researcher who looks at these trends using the Global Sociological Survey. And so again, not looking at kind of denominational reports, but what are people reporting about themselves? Do you attend a religious community? What size is it? And so forth. And what they found is that the trends that I'm about to show you about the PCUSA, that we are entirely typical of religious communities across the country. So what has been going on with our churches? So here, what I'm presenting in this slide is information on the left, which has to do with what proportion of our churches are in certain membership sizes. And then on the right, the pie chart is the number of members, the proportion of our overall membership that attends a congregation of that size. I want to say quickly about why I do draw the buckets where I do. So I'm looking at fewer than 100 members, and we are talking about members here, not attendance. It's just much easier for us in the way that we gather statistics through our annual session statistical reports to talk about members. And so there's some kind of adjustments that are made here. But so under 100 members, 100 to 300 members, 300 to 600 members, and more than 600 members. I like these groups because sociologically, what it means to be a religious community is very different at these different cutoffs. Some of you will be familiar with the various descriptions of these kind of brackets as being the family size church, not in the sense that everybody is kind of related, the very smallest churches, the pastoral size church, a single solo pastor, the program size church where you begin to have maybe one or two additional staff persons, maybe an associate pastor, and then the largest churches were referred to as the corporate churches sometimes. And what it means to live in religious community is very different sociologically at these different kind of break points in terms of membership or attendance. What we have seen was that in 2010, we had at that point reached the stage where 51% of all PCUSA congregations had 100 or fewer members. And again, that was very typical then, and where we are now is very typical. If you ask most Presbyterians what's an average size church, they wouldn't tell you that half of our churches were 100 or less, because only 13% of PCUSA members attended a church of that size. So the experience of most of our folks are in churches that are larger than that. In fact, almost 6 in 10, or 3 of 5, depending on how you want to do the breakdown, of Presbyterians in 2010 attended churches that had more than 300 members. And so, if you're attending a church of 300, a lot of those folks think, well, I attend a small church, even though only 13% of our churches were in that size range of 300 to 600. And only 4% of our churches were larger than that. So even taken together, there's 17%, that's about 1 in 6 of our congregations had more than 300 members, but they accounted for almost 60% of all Presbyterians. So what's happened in the last decade? Well, in the last decade, the percentage of churches that have fewer than 100 members has increased by 10% almost. We've gone from 51% to 60% of our churches. And again, this is not in any way atypical of religious communities in the United States generally. It's right in track with that. We've seen an increase in the percentage of Presbyterians who are in those churches of that size. It's gone from 13% to 18%. We have seen the number of churches that have more than 300 members has gone from 17% combined, so 300 and the 600 and up, to down to 12%. So only 1 in 8 of our congregations have more than 300 members. But interestingly enough, although there has been some increase in the proportion of our members who are in churches of fewer than 100, the proportion that are in churches of about 100 to 300, that's grown a little bit. The group that has been the most impacted have been those congregations of 300 to 600. They're the ones that have seen the biggest impact, both in their proportion of churches that are that size and the proportion of Presbyterians who attend those churches. So again, think about this in terms of kind of the economy and so forth. These are the churches that would in the past have had one perhaps associate pastor or a full-time director of education, Christian education. So, what's driving this? Why are the churches getting smaller? Well, some of it is because of the population decline. Some of it is because we're seeing this trend about people not joining organizations generally and religious communities being caught up on that. And so what we're seeing now is that there is more people who are in smaller churches because their churches have gotten smaller, but the proportion of people who are actually in our largest churches is increasing. So let me go back and look again. Let's look one more time. This is 2010. You'll see that 27% of our members were in churches of more than 600, which made up 4% of our congregations. But now, for 2018, which is the last year that we've been able to do this kind of analysis on, we sort of are gathering the 2020 numbers, as you know. It's still 4% of our churches, but they're now 29% of our members are in those churches. And this is the other thing that Travis and others have found in terms of the Global Sociological Survey, is that yes, there are increasing proportions that are in smaller communities because there are more smaller churches, and churches are getting smaller, so the communities they're a part of are becoming smaller. But there is also a consolidation of people into the larger churches, so that they now make up those very largest churches, 600 or more members, make up 29% of all Presbyterians, as opposed to just 27% a few years ago, a decade ago. But I see in the chat the question about this means more of our churches members attend mid-sized churches. More of our church members are attending, really, if what I think of as a mid-sized church in terms of kind of the sociological dynamics of the 300 to 600, those are the churches that in fact are seeing the most impact, the most decrease as a proportion of our members. We're having more individuals who are attending these pastor-sized churches. That's the group that it's been, let me go back a second. Let's just double check. That was 32%. So yeah, it was 29% of our members were in those pastor-sized churches of 100 to 300 10 years ago. That has increased some, but because it's mainly because of churches that were 10 years ago right on the cusp. Maybe they were 300, 350, and now they've moved down to just under the 300 come into that. So some increase there, but the group that's been most impacted by this has been our churches of 300 to 600. They've seen the biggest drop in percentage. They've gone from 13% of our congregations and 31% of our members to 8% of our congregations and 21% of the members. That's the group that's been the most impacted, both in terms of congregations and in terms of our members. Now, one of the things that we thought would happen if at the beginning of this century, because of the increase in congregations that had fewer members than 100, was that we were going to see a kind of exponential rise in the use of commissioned ruling elders and commissioned pastors. And so in this chart, the line chart you see on the left was that's data primarily in fact, data entirely from the first decade of the 21st century. So from basically 1999, right on the cusp, to 2009. And you can see that we went from having about 150 commissioned ruling elder, commissioned pastors in 1999 to having over 800 by 2008 and 2009. So just exponential growth. Had we continued on that path, that's the straight line that's drawn in that chart on the left, by about 2015, we would have had 1,200 commissioned pastors, commissioned lay pastors. The statisticians were telling us that when you see that very kind of rapid increase, you should expect to begin to taper off and level off a little bit. And so they were projecting that by about 2015, we would be just over 1,000 CREs and CPs. So that's that kind of curved line. But what we actually saw is that in the first part of the last decade, we hit a kind of stabilization, and we never made it. In fact, we still haven't made it to the 1,000 CREs and CPs. It began to kind of level off into a narrow band of between roughly 910 and 950, fluctuating some from year to year. Now, we are beginning to see in the very last few years, and so I'll be looking very closely to see where the numbers come in for 2020. But we are beginning to see toward the end of this most recent decade, the numbers are beginning to trend up. But it still is nothing like what we thought we were going to be seeing 10 years ago. Now, the one thing that I would point out at this point about this, though, is that because we have fewer churches than we had 20 years ago, the proportion of congregations that are being served by CREs can still be increasing even as the numbers are remaining fairly flat. And so, one of the things that we get sometimes in the perception is, well, we feel like we're using a lot more CREs and CPs than we were in the past. Well, we are using them in a higher proportion of congregations than we were, even as if the numbers stayed fairly steady. But it hasn't increased as rapidly as we thought. So, again, we're really looking here at, what this trend is in the kind of types of pastoral leaders and leaderships that we're having. We're not, I see a question in the chat about, well, what's the value? Do we only measure this by membership and so forth? And again, I would firmly say, no, the value of a congregation is not established only by its membership, but there are real economic factors, as we started talking about at the very beginning. If you don't have a certain core mass or critical mass, You can't sustain a dental practice. If you don't have a certain core mass, you can't maintain certain types of economic enterprises. If you don't have certain levels of participation and support, you're not going to be able to sustain a religious community either. At least not in the model that we have had for the last century of, every religious community has its own pastoral leader who is assigned to serve that community and that community itself. So these are the kind of things we're talking about. We're not here trying to say that these congregations are in any way failing in their mission or not fulfilling their gospel mandate. What we're talking about are factors that will shape the kind of leadership that they will be able to have, the kind of religious community that they can be, because of these other factors that come along with these decreases in membership and affiliation. We'll shift gears a little bit and talk about another thing that we are seeing, and that is that Protestant pastors are getting older on average. In 1992, which is that's the year I finished my PhD, almost 30 years ago now, 3/4 of Protestant pastors were under the age of 55. But by 2017, half were then over age 56. Again, we're talking about some of these will be individuals who have simply aged into higher age brackets during that period, right? In 1992, I would have been in that under 40 cohort. I'm not there anymore. And so, I haven't quite made it to the highest age cohort in this group yet, but I'm getting closer every day. So, that's part of it. But again, we're talking about the proportion in age range across the whole spectrum. So this includes all the people who have come into ministry during the last 30 years. So we're seeing now that our ministers are older on average than they were a generation ago. And this has been the case not only, in fact, among Protestants, but as this chart shows, this draws in some other kinds of faith communities, Catholic, Orthodox, and so forth. This chart's a little tricky to read because to get it on a landscape slide, you got to kind of lay it on its side. But if you kind of just keep in mind that as you go up the lines, you're getting older in years, you can see that in 2016, the distribution for almost all religious communities skewed 50 or higher. There were only 3 religious groups, the Presbyterian Church in America, the Evangelical Church, and Orthodox Judaism, who had most of their pastoral leadership, most of their religious community leadership, who were under 50 years of age, or that the median age was below that. So this has been a trend, again, across religious communities broadly within American society. Now, one of the things when we look specifically at our numbers, and so this chart that I'm putting up now has to do with the age distribution of PCUSA ministers. This is as of 2020. You can see that the largest single group of PCUSA ministers is the 65 and up, which makes up a majority of PCUSA teaching elders, ministers of word and sacrament in 2020. 57% were age 65 and up. Now, again, keep in mind, one of the things that happens here is that in each of the other buckets, so the people who are in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, or the first half of their 60s, those are 10-year spans or even 5-year spans in case of the 60s to 64. And we've got probably 25 or 30 years are in that last bucket. So there's just a lot more time span to draw together into that. But do notice the pattern here. Only 1% of our ministers of word and sacrament are still in their 20s. Some of that is a factor of the educational requirements that we have. It's very difficult to graduate college and seminary and be ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA before you're about 25, 26 years old. There are some people who do it because they finish school more quickly, but it's very unusual. So it's not surprising that we don't have a lot of 20-somethings. But again, the under 40 cohort, under 50. So if we include the 40s, the 30s, and the 20 years, those in their 20s, we're still at only 17%. That's that 1 in 6 number of our ministers who are in those age ranges. If it's the under 40, then we're only at 7%. We're only at about 1 in 12. The question I see here in the chat about how many of the 65 and up are honorably retired. In the Office of General Assembly, we get that information. We've decided we're not even tracking it anymore in terms of this because we have so many people who are honorably retired who are still serving either full-time or part-time that has become kind of a, they're honorably retired so that they can start drawing their pension from the board, but they're still as involved in ministry as they have been in the past. So, we have really started trying to kind of focus more on what's just the age range of pastoral leaders and not watching as closely about the question about being honorably retired or not. But there's one piece of this that I want to kind of raise this morning because this is a Synod gathering in leaders. One of the things that occurred to me when I was pulling all these things together and reading through this again yesterday in ways that hadn't really struck me before. But when you've got a majority who are 65 and up, some of whom are still in active service, some of whom are not, but when you've got a majority, that is a group that the way our polity works can exercise enormous influence over what happens in terms of shaping the future of our mid-councils and our congregations, particularly when we come to higher councils of the church, where the leadership, or the bodies that are making the decisions are those who are in the ordained ministry, and there's equal numbers of teaching elders and ruling elders. If 57%, now granted, some portion of those folks are going to be at a stage in life where they're not going to be actively involved in any way. They may not be serving in a church at all. They may not even be able to come to Presbyterian meetings anymore. But still, they have a very huge impact on decisions that are getting made. And so we really have to think about, what impact is that? And are there things that we need to think about to be sure that there's not that decisions are really being made that are forward thinking and not being shaped about, this is what my experience in ministry was and so forth. And really thinking about, what are the changes that need to happen and being able to hear and to listen to new ways of doing things when many of our decision makers, if they all showed up, a majority of our decision makers are already ages 65 and up. The serving percentages, I don't have those numbers specifically, so I don't want to try to guess on those. I see that in the chat. I don't want to make a guess about that if I haven't had a chance to actually get the firm numbers from my colleague, Chris Valerius, who manages the roles of the church. So I don't want to make a guess about that. The main thing that I want us to see here is to think about, the impact that this could have on the decision-making of higher councils of the church. The other thing that I want to point out is that there has been a lot of question about, as people move into retirements, are we going to have a shortage of clergy? And I've simply got to say that so far we haven't seen it. Even with 57% of our current ministers of word and sacrament being age 65 or older, we've not yet seen retirements causing a clergy shortage. What we've seen both in the Presbyterian Church more generally, Presbyterian Church in specific, and when I talk about our ecumenical partners more generally, is we have a real distribution problem. We have more ministers in some areas than we need and fewer ministers than we need in other areas. And a lot of that is now following along this kind of rural-urban divide. As it is true about American population generally, it's been true about our ministers and ministers of word and sacrament. There has been a consolidation into the more urban areas, which has made it more of a challenge for us to fill positions in more rural areas. And so, that's part of what we're seeing. Some of that is, again, the economics, particularly if you have two-income families. It can be difficult for the trailing spouse of a minister to find work in those communities, and so they're less likely to want to move their families to those communities. There's a lot of factors that come into play here. And, but that's what we're seeing, at least so far. Whether that can be sustained for another 10 years, we will see, because, part of it will be how many, as I always point out in these conversations, the match is of supply and demand. One side may be how many ministers you have, but then what's the demand? How many congregations do you have that can afford a full-time ministry? And so that will affect that balance. So, but one of the things that has been driving this age distribution is that we have seen that over my lifetime, that more and more folks who go into ministry generally go into ministry not right out of college. So the track that I followed from college to seminary, in my case to graduate school, I was ordained while I was working on my PhD. And then, kind of straight into ministry. That was kind of the norm for my generation coming out of the 70s and the early 80s. It has not been the norm for the last several decades. More and more of our folks are entering ministry later in life. So I want to look at kind of what we're seeing now about folks that are coming into ministry. This was an interesting piece of information that we received recently from ATS. ATS is Association of Theological Schools, and it's showing the seminary enrollment trends that we have seen since 1990, so the last 30 years. And it's looking at, what were the schools in their enrollment, was their enrollment stable or was it growing? And you can see that in the 1990s, more than half of the seminaries, their enrollment was either stable or growing. That began to change in 2000, around the year 2000. So even in 2001, 2002, it was still growing, but they began to drop beginning in 2003 and dropped fairly steadily until 2008. What's interesting about those red dots that are kind of highlighted in pink is that the number of the enrollment began to go up around 2008, 2009. Now think about that. What was happening in our culture, in our society in 2009? It was the economic crisis. And so there were a number of people who were being dislocated from the broader economy who began in that period to think about the possibility of ministry as a vocation. And so we saw some uptick, but it didn't last. Once the economy began to recover, you can see that the percentage of schools whose enrollment was increasing again began to trend downward. What was very interesting to them is that in 2020, suddenly it was back, the numbers that were stable or increasing in 2020 ticked back up. and went back to a majority. And of course, what happened in 2020? Well, the pandemic happened. So what ATS is trying to figure out is, again, is this something similar to what happened in 2008, where there was a major shock to the economy, to the culture, and it led people to consider religious vocation and led them into seminary study? Or is this different because in 2020, what happened was the schools themselves, in response to the pandemic, had to move instruction online? And so that there was this possibility for people who didn't have to relocate, who didn't have to leave jobs that they already had. It opened up the possibility, if you simply had an interest in theology or ethics or something, to take courses in seminary, because it was now more readily available because it was being done online for everybody. So ATS is watching this very, very closely to see whether this marks a trend or whether this was really something that was a kind of coincidence of circumstance that could show that there is a broader interest in religion and theology and ethics that people have, and people want to have a deeper understanding of it, and they took advantage of the virtual instruction that was available in the seminaries? Or will this in fact be a trend of people coming into ministry? Because one of the reasons that's going to be very important is that what had also been true during this same period, this 20-year period, is we had reached a point about 5-10 years ago where most of the students who went to seminary had no desire in going into vocational service as pastors or religious communities leaders. They had an interest in studying theology and ethics and thinking about how religious life applies in other sectors, and doing kind of nonprofit community ministry kind of approaches to life and service and vocation, but not pastoral leadership. And so, it may simply be that there was the moving of instruction into virtual settings allowed even more of those people to take advantage of what was being offered in the seminaries, which again tells us something interesting, though, more broadly about the interest in religious faith and the religious tradition and wisdom within the broader society, that goes against some of what we hear about the rise of the nuns, the non-religious affiliated. I'll come back to that again at the very end a little bit. I mentioned that many of our inquirers and candidates are coming into this in mid-career or not right out of college. So you can see the age ranges. One of the things that is interesting is that the average age of our inquirers and candidates has gotten younger, or at least the proportion that are younger has increased fairly significantly in the last 10 years. So that in 2010, only just over a quarter of all of our inquirers and candidates were in their 20s. By 2020, almost 40% of our inquirers and candidates are in their 20s. So again, think about what that implies about what you hear about so many of our, millennials. Again, we have fewer inquirers and candidates overall than we had then, but the proportion is younger now than it was then. So this does show that among millennials that there is this interest, or at least for some, that is leading them to go. And this is not just seminary enrollment. Of course, this is the folks who are in the process to potentially become ministers of word and sacrament within the Presbyterian Church USA. These are inquirers and candidates who are exploring that vocation. It's also interesting to note, though, that at the upper end, we've also seen some increase, so that we now had to add by 2020, we had a significantly enough, we hit finally 1% of our inquirers and candidates who are in their 70s. And so they show up. So it's still the case that the majority, 60% roughly, so 3 out of 5 of our inquirers and candidates are in their 30s or older. So it's not that pipeline that was true of my colleagues who came into ministry in the 1980s. it's still mainly people who are coming in at points in life where they've already had other vocational experience of some kind. But we are beginning to see the average ages go down after decades of it just, getting the average age getting older and older and older. We don't survey our inquiries and candidates themselves to know exactly what their sense is in terms of whether they're looking to serve congregations. I know anecdotally from conversations that I have with our inquiries and candidates when I meet with them, that there are a number of them that are also very much like the typical seminarians, not thinking in terms of congregational ministry. They are thinking about wanting calls to what we would call specialized ministry. I think in some respects, some of their expectations need to be challenged, and some of their assumptions need to have them think about more critically. I know I see a lot of folks, who are saying, well, I don't want to go into congregational ministry. I want to go into chaplaincy. Chaplaincy is not a growing field. We're beginning to see that, there's actually some even paring back, so that there was a kind of move to hospitals having formal chaplains on staff, even some corporations who in around 2010 were beginning to explore with the idea of a secular corporation having chaplaincy kind of positions. My sense and what I'm hearing from folks who are looking more broadly is that that's starting to kind of tighten up. I know that the people who who say, well, what I really would like to do, I'd like to become a professor of theology or something like that. I've got to tell you, all of the markers in terms of faculty positions, and I say this as somebody who was in academia for 20 years and has a lot of friends and colleagues who are still in it full time. The job prospect, the idea that, well, if I can't find a church, I'll become a professor, you've got the mathematics of that completely backwards. It is much, much easier to find a pastoral position than it is to find a faculty position in the university or seminary setting. There's more and more use of contingent faculty rather than tenure track. I mean, there's just a lot of factors that are going on there. And if, one of the things that may happen coming out of COVID, if there is this kind of continuing offering of courses online, I think you're going to see that that's going to be even more so the case of contingent faculty rather than full-time faculty, just because of the nature of online instruction. Question here about how many of those over 40 are considered commissioned route instead of the demands of seminary. We don't get reports from presbyteries about how many people may have begun whatever training program that they may have that is required before somebody can be considered for commission. So I just don't have any data on that one way or the other. All right. Just quickly, another point on this age ranges, you'll see that these age ranges are pretty consistent both across, both for men and women. There's a slight tendency of a few more women in the older age categories. So the 50s, 60s, and 70s, their percentages are a little higher than men. So a few more women who later in their professional lives, later in life generally, are considering it. But overall, the numbers are pretty consistent. The only place where there's a major difference is those that are in their 30s. So there's a full 10% difference between the proportion of men. Men make up 33% of the men that we have that are in the process of preparation are in their 30s as compared to 23% of women, which may say something about child rearing age, as we all know from kind of broader things in society. Beginning families, beginning to have children is something that is happening later in life than it has in the past. And so that may be some of the kind of traditional gender expectations and models that are impacting that. But other than that, it's generally pretty consistent. This next slide, I'm going to just own up. This is not what you should ever do with a PowerPoint slide, but knowing that these PowerPoints are going to be available to you, there's a couple of quotes here that I wanted to draw your attention to as we transition to the next piece that I want to talk about, that I knew you'd want the quotes. So I just went ahead and put them on a PowerPoint slide, and I'm just going to kind of read them to you. This is from an article that was released by Religious News Service that was following up and reporting on the Gallup survey that we talked about earlier, that was written by Wesley Granberg Michelson. Wesley Granberg Michelson is the former General Secretary of the Reformed Church in America, who retired a few years ago. And he was looking through the Gallup and talking about some other things that he was seeing. And he noted this. He says, what's dramatically declining in the United States is white Christianity. People of color are actually preventing a more precipitous drop in overall church participation. The so-called nuns, who have no religious affiliation, who enjoy lattes at downtown coffee shops on Sunday mornings instead of singing in church, are largely young, hip, and white. But the country's demographic future as a whole is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, and this will impact the religious landscape. Figures from the 2010 census found that there were 43 million foreign-born residents in the United States, 74% of whom were Christians. Sociologists report that the experience of immigration increases the intensity of whatever religious convictions are held by the migrants. So while in our society more generally there is a decrease in religious commitment, among those who are immigrating to this country, the process of immigration itself tends to increase their religious commitment. Sociologists find that these immigrants find religious homes in the United States within existing congregations and through establishing new ones, often using facilities of declining churches. This is very, I think, important for us to understand. And it is, in fact, something that we are seeing within the Presbyterian Church USA. This is demographic information about persons of color who are inquirers and candidates in the Presbyterian Church. And so this is the latest reporting that we have. This is December 31, 2020. If you take all the persons of color together, you will see that they make up about 24% of all of our inquirers and candidates. Now, in purely statistical language, what we would say is that they are overrepresented. That is to say that as a proportion of our inquirers and candidates, they are much higher than the proportion of Presbyterian Church USA members in whole. So while we are still at only about 10%, 10 to 12% persons of color as members of the Presbyterian Church USA, we have double that in terms of our inquirers and candidates. The other thing that you will see here is that, and this particularly if you break out then, those further break out the different person of color categories into male, female, and then put them to the women, we have more women who are inquirers and candidates now than we have men. 56% of women under care are our candidates and inquirers under care are women. And in fact, we have ordained more women than men every year since 2012. This gender difference holds true even across most of our persons of color. So that the only group in which that there is still a significant percentage more males than females is among Asian American, the Asian category, which, as you all know, for us is predominantly, not exclusively by any means, but predominantly Korean. That's the only group in which women are not either the majority or right at the majority of those that are under care. This holds true, again, as we're seeing among ordinations, so that we are seeing that, again, this is, part of this, you'll see it's a slightly different proportion that are persons of color. The portion of the pie goes down a little bit if you look at our ordinations over the last 6 years, from 2014 through 2020. But part of that is because we're seeing more and more persons of color coming into the system and into the process, and so they have not yet had time to reach the point where they can begin looking for calls. But again, if you take the aggregate total, it's about 18%. That's more than 1 in 6 of our ordinands in the last 6 years have been persons of color. And again, during that period, the percentage of Presbyterians generally has been about 10 to 12% that are persons of color. So we are seeing more and more of our leadership that are, as a proportion, that are going to be persons of color and are going to be women. And as you can see, in the last 6 years, the proportion of our new ordinations that have been white males, like myself, down to 32%. So though it may be the case that historically, our congregations have predominantly been led by white males, that cannot be true of our future. There simply are not going to be enough white male pastors for every church that has historically been led by a white male pastor. Over time, there will not be enough male pastors generally to lead congregations that have been historically led by male pastors. The shift is moving in the direction of women. Couple of things just really quickly, and so that we do have some time for some more general discussion. Questions about how long is it taking folks to find a first call? What we're finding is that about 35% of our candidates are getting calls within 6 months of when they are certified ready to receive a call. About another quarter, just over another quarter, are receiving calls within the first year, within the next 7 to 12 months. So within a year, almost 2/3 of our candidates are finding their first calls. And that those trends are pretty consistent for both women and men. There's not major statistical difference variation off the overall average as there is between men and women. So their experiences are basically the same. At least anecdotally, it's very hard for us to know how long it takes a minister who has experience to find a subsequent call. There's not everybody has to go through church leadership connection and those kind of things. And so it's just harder for us to gather the data. But at least anecdotally, these trends look pretty consistent to what we see or are being reported by ministers who are looking for new calls. That if I were still in pastoral ministry and I decided to put my PIF out, it's kind of, about 2/3 will get a call within the first year. So it doesn't look like that those who are seeking first calls, that their experience of finding a call is dramatically different than what we at least know anecdotally about others who are in ministry. Finally, 2 hopeful points. And again, my apologies. These are quotes that I thought you would be interested in having, so I wanted to be sure that I got them into the PowerPoint. And again, we're going back to the article by Wesley Granberg Michelson. He notes that the latest available data from the General Social Survey, I've mentioned that a couple of times this morning, a major tool for sociologists, shows that the percentage of mainline Protestants in the US recently increased for the first time in nearly 30 years, from 10.2% to 10.8%, while Catholics and evangelicals showed a moderate decline. So as a proportion of the whole population, the evangelicals declined for the first time that they have in more than 30 years, and mainlines actually increased. Researchers caution that subsequent data would be needed to verify a trend, yet the graph of steady, relentless decline stopped by a sharp recent uptick can't be ignored. It's there. the sociologists who are looking at this in the General Social Survey think that one of the factors may be that for many, evangelical has become more of a cultural and political label in the US than a theological one. And some evangelicals who have left versions of republicanism defined by Trump are also discarding the religious label of evangelical and migrating to more mainline congregations. So again, it'd be something very interesting to watch. But this is the first time in decades that we've actually seen that as a, now remember, the proportion of Americans that are members of religious communities is declining, but the proportion that are in the mainline has ticked up for the first time in decades. The second thing is that the decline in membership in churches, synagogues, and mosques cannot be equated with decline in religious curiosity or practice. When nuns are asked why they have disaffiliated from any religious organization, only 22% of them say it is because they do not believe in God. The primary challenge facing pastors, rabbis, imams is how to invite non-members into an authentic experience of God rather than to persuade them to join or rejoin a religious organization. So even as we're seeing this decline in membership and affiliation among the nuns, it's not that they are rejecting belief in God or in spirituality. And so the challenge before us is to think about how it is that we offer to them the wisdom and of our faith and our traditions in a way that is open to them and to their searching and longings for the spiritual, and not so much focused on the membership. So again, this PowerPoint presentation will be available to all of you. There's a slide at the end that has exactly the links to both the Gallup information and some of the other things that I've resorted to this morning. And so I'm going to stop at this point my screen sharing, exit this slide. We've got a few minutes here, and I think I got some of the stuff that went scrolling by in the chat, but probably missed some other things. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to, what do we need to go back and touch on in the minutes we've got left?
There's a question, what is the percentage for non-white persons?
Percentage for in what? Percentage of what that are persons of color?
Tim, that question came from me. For first call, you showed the slide for 6 months to a year, but that primarily, I would think, for persons that are Caucasian. Do you have statistics for those who are non-white?
So I've off the top of my head, Warren, I don't remember if I've disaggregated that according to persons of color. What I would say is that it can't be substantially different. It can't be, just, they're all the folks at the top end and not the folks at the shorter end. In part because the proportion of ordinands who are persons of color to the proportion of inquirers and candidates who are persons of color are quite consistent. And so that would suggest that they're moving through the system at about the same rate as the others. But I can certainly go back and run some of that and follow up with you about it.
Thank you.
Question from Robin, do you think the Matthew 25 initiative is more appealing to the non-white demographic?
I don't know how that appeals in terms of persons of color. I think one of the things that we probably need to give some attention to is how appealing it probably is to the millennials and Gen Xers. It does seem to track those kind of social justice and social concerns do seem to track well with that generational cohort. And so I do think that the showing how that those concerns can arise out of a life of faith and a faith commitment would appeal to that generational cohort, which also, by the way, has a broader proportion of persons of color in it. So the two, again, at that point, trying to disaggregate. So what of that is interest because of their experience of persons of color in the society versus generational? Because again, there's a much higher proportion of persons of color generationally in those generational cohorts than there are in the older cohorts.
One more. I don't think you answered this one yet. How many of those over 40 are considering the commissioned route instead of the demands of seminary?
Yeah, I did take a stab at that, but maybe I wasn't clear enough about the question. As I said, presbyteries are solely responsible for the training that is required to become to receive a commission if you're a ruling elder. They don't report any of that about how many they're training or any of that. The only thing that gets reported each year is how many commissions did you give. So I just have no way of knowing whether we're seeing a lot of folks who are taking training in hopes of being commissioned instead of going to seminary. I know that I do encounter folks who are ruling elders who have been commissioned, who are now taking advantage of more distant, even before the pandemic, we're taking advantage of more distance-oriented seminary options like from the University of Dubuque and some other places to get seminary training in hopes of eventually becoming ordained or, and moving toward being ordained as ministers of word and sacrament and not, and not staying with their ordination as ruling elder. But I don't get data that could help me answer that question about, how many people are saying, well, I'll just do this instead of the other, because there's no reporting to our offices around it.
I think we have time for one more. There's a lengthy one here from Mark and Lehigh. Since 60% of all PCUSA churches are under 100 of attending members, and then they cannot support at least one full-time pastor by themselves, why doesn't the PCUSA consider the system change for the others, 40% of all PCUSA churches who might be financially stable, to support the financially difficult churches? We are all one body, one church. It seems PCUSA calling and installing pastor to individual church system depends on the free market principle. If you cannot support your own pastor, your church will be faded or perish away.
Yeah, I mean, some of you may know, I believe that this is in fact the system that they use in the Church of Scotland. So our mother church, and we talk about how we're the mother church in some other places, but our mother church, I think, uses a system that's similar to this. I think there's a lot of resistance. Frankly, there's a lot of resistance among our ministers of word and sacrament. There's a lot of resistance among our congregations, many of whom feel, even though they may be larger, are feeling their own financial stresses and strains. There's a lot of resistance. So yeah, there's certainly an argument to be made. One of the points that I often make to folks is that there's always another model. And so you've got to figure out why you're choosing the model that you want. For example, one of the other models that could be used would be for those smaller congregations to say, rather than having our own unique minister, let's partner with 3 or 4 other congregations and hire a minister of word and sacrament, not with the expectation that that person will be in every pulpit on every Sunday, but with the expectation that they will be with us on this Sunday, and we may watch the live streaming or whatever on the other Sundays when they're in the other locations. And so, we won't just do the sacrament of the table on the first Sunday. Maybe we'll do it the second or the third Sunday when the teaching elder, the minister of word and sacrament, is with us. So, I mean, there are a lot of different models that can be considered. I served for a dozen years in a community where there was about 5 times the Jewish population than there is typically in the United States. And during that time, my wife was working at the Hebrew Home of Washington as a healthcare provider. And I got to know a lot of Jewish rabbis, and they thought our whole pledge system was just nuts. I mean, if the way a synagogue runs is that the leaders of the synagogue put together a budget, figure out how many people are in the synagogue, and send folks a bill to cover the budget. there are other ways that we could do things. And so, certainly we could consider that. And, there are some places where we're kind of putting our toe in the water with established congregations that are doing that in terms of supporting ministries and new worshiping communities. So we may see some of that down the road, but there is, at this point, just, to report what we're seeing when those kind of discussions come up, it's certainly a viable option. It's used by other Reformed churches around the world, but there is resistance to it, both among many of our ministers of Word and Sacrament and also among many of our congregations.
All right, Tim, thanks for your time here. We are scheduled for a break until 11. For those of you who are going to be listening to Wayne, Bending the Book Without Breaking the Rules, you'll stay on this Zoom. Anyone else going to the other 3 workshops, they're separate Zooms that should have been in the email that was sent out yesterday by me, and you'll be going to a different Zoom for that. So at this time, we'll take try and be back by 11 or a little after, as we can try to start on time right around 11. And take a break. We'll see you soon.
Wait, Mike, this is Sue.
Sorry.
One more announcement we were going to make, and we are going to start right at 11, so please be back. But you were sent a sheet yesterday that is for tomorrow morning's opening workshop with Graham Standish. Please have that printed out and with you for the morning. Graham is going to be using that sheet throughout his time with us. You received the codes and that sheet yesterday. If you did not get it or can't see it, send Mike an email and we'll get it out to you. Thanks a lot. Tim, thank you very, very much. If we could clap, we would be clapping. Appreciate the numbers. So those of you who are in the workshop that is on the same codes can stay right. Are you going to turn it off, Mike, or leave it on?
I'll turn it off.